In 1942, a forest ranger of the Nanda Devi National Park, in the vast, remote vertices of the Indian Himalayas, stumbled upon something that would baffle scientists and anthropologists to this day. Amidst this tiny, relatively shallow lake, hidden away between steep cliffs on all sides, the ranger stumbled upon the skeletal remains of what seemed to be hundreds of individuals. The location, Roopkund Lake, is nestled in the Indian Himalayas at an elevation of over 5,000 meters, in an incredibly remote area, now known colloquially as the Skeleton Lake. This remote glacial lake in the state of Uttarakhand, India, has created far more questions than it has answers. The presence of skeletal remains, many of which still lie preserved in the ice and snow, transforms Roopkund into a kind of open-air crypt, one shrouded in extreme mystery of rare proportions. This immediately begs the question, in the ever-hostile remote area of Roopkund Lake, why are there hundreds of dead bodies in one of the most dangerous and inhospitable places on Earth? In a hidden, craterous formation, what could possibly be the reason they ended up there? After this modern finding, in curious human fashion, news spread and immediate speculation occurred. Initial theories ranged from secret wartime activities to an early epidemic to a catastrophic natural disaster, with local legends adding their own colorful perspectives to the puzzle. This is a particular area of interest here. The local population knew about this site, with slightly varying tales of a pilgrimage gone awry, or the wrath of local deities was often cited in hushed tones among the population. However, as intriguing as these stories are, they barely scratch the surface of the true, baffling nature of Roopkund Lake. First, we need to back up. We need to explain the backdrop to this discovery. The modern historical context of Roopkund Lake in 1942, amidst the turmoil of World War II, a forest and park official, Hari Kishan Madwal, in the uncharted reaches of the Indian Himalayas, stumbled upon the scene. He found the lake's edges littered with human skeletons, now believed to be the remains of around 800 individuals. This chilling discovery quickly garnered attention, not just for its eerie nature, but also for the questions it posed. The immediate theory, given the historical place, was that during World War II, Japan made it much further into Indian territory than expected, and this was a graveyard housing stranded Japanese soldiers who ventured too deep into the reaches of India, whether for a planned secret invasion or an undiscovered existing operation. This, as history tells us, was not the case. With the local, relatively isolated population knowing about the skeletons of Roopkund Lake, it was known as a quiet omen amongst them, best not to be disturbed. The early theories about these skeletal remains were deeply entwined with local folklore and legend. There's a few local interpretations here. One popular narrative among the local communities was the story of a pilgrimage gone disastrously wrong. According to legend, the king of ancient Kannauj, Raja Jashvidal, and his pregnant wife, along with servants, went on a pilgrimage to Nanda Devi Shrine. But, after dancing at the shrine, disturbing the Hindu goddess of Parvati, which Mount Nanda Devi is an incarnation of, sent a deadly hailstorm onto the pilgrims in the lake. The second interpretation is that Parvati was enraged by the pilgrims' earthly pleasures. Given Nanda Devi was a pilgrimage site, Parvati wasn't happy with seeing gleeful, materialistic pilgrims at her site, thus sending a whirlwind storm that swept them into the lake. Oddly enough, this legend seemed to find some resonance in the locals' initial examinations of the skeletons, which suggested that many skulls bore signs of trauma, possibly caused by something akin to strong blows to the head. This initial finding is a likely basis for these legends themselves. As modern species, these folklore narratives Indigenous stories are often shrouded in an intense arrogance. There's a common impetus within us to brush these things aside. Yet, these stories wisely reflect the ingrained respect and fear for the natural world that is characteristic of Himalayan cultures. Roopkund, in these tales, is not just a geographical location, but a testament to the power of nature and the gods. To the local populace, the lake can be seen as a boundary between the earthly realm and the divine, a place where human transgressions meet with celestial judgment. The early theories and local legends around Roopkund Lake not only underscore the mystery of the site, but also highlight the cultural and spiritual dimensions that local communities attach to mysterious cases. These stories, passed down orally over generations, form an integral part of the historical tapestry of places like Roopkund Lake, blending facts with folklore and science with spirituality. This in part explains the relative silence around these skeletons until its modern rediscovery. And yet, for science itself, this is when the weirdness really starts. Around 10 years after its rediscovery, the initial examinations of the Roopkund skeletons began in the 1950s. The first studies were basic in nature, focusing on examining the skeletons and artifacts found at the site. These early investigations concluded that the skeletons should be dated back to the 12th to 15th centuries, speculating that the individuals might have been victims of an epidemic, landslide, or actually a severe hailstorm. However, these early studies had limitations. They were constrained by the technological and methodological standards of the time. There was little in the way of precise dating techniques or genetic analysis, and the conclusions were largely speculative based on physical examination and the study of artifacts found alongside the skeletons. Nonetheless, for the next 50 to 60 years, this was the timeline that was concluded. We still didn't know exactly what happened, but we roughly knew the time period these people existed, right? Well, no. Turns out we didn't. With the advent of advanced DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, dietary reconstruction, and newer forensic examination, we made some startling discoveries. In 2004, more advanced research was done. At the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad, India, scientists sampled genome-wide data from 38 individuals, extracting DNA from bone matter. This found that 23 of the bodies were from the year 800 AD, this being much earlier than expected. Also, of these 23, they were found largely from South Asian heritage, consistent with the people inhabiting India. The timeline shift here is certainly interesting, and the findings do show head trauma. This does point us in a specific direction, that being, indeed, a pilgrimage gone awry. At least a theory that's very likely. Great. So what's the problem here? The problem is the remaining 15 skeletons. The discovery here has baffled scientists to this day. One of the individuals is from Southeast Asian descent, and the remaining 14 of these individuals are of Mediterranean descent and from the year 1800. Not only is there a group of deceased individuals, but 1,000 years later, it's also from a place 1,000 miles away, somewhere with nearly zero cultural connection to Hinduism. But their genealogy gets a little stranger. Their DNA sequenced, with populations primarily deriving from the large island of Crete in the South Mediterranean Sea. For many of my history friends here, particularly of the classics, we know that Crete was the locus in the very beginnings of what we now consider ancient Greece proper. Crete housed the Minoan civilization, one of the oldest civilizations in human history, with archaeological findings around 3000 BC, containing technologies such as bronze metallurgy. Now, these 15 skeletons, primarily sharing DNA from those found in Crete, may not technically mean much, but it's a jarring, odd, very specific finding nonetheless. Crete is an island, isolated from mainland connections to the Middle East and Asia, like places such as Anatolia or Peloponnese. Everything I have read around this case doesn't seem to put much emphasis on their genealogy being rooted specifically from Crete. On the surface, it doesn't seem like much, but its historical context, its isolated geography, very hyper-specific cultural practices, it's just an odd, very specific finding. It's still something that I can't quite shake from my head, and feels a bit more significant than what is often highlighted from the case. These hyper-specifics could truly mean nothing, or it could mean something quite drastic, something we've yet to uncover. So, how do anthropologists siphon through this? There are so many strange things about this. The year 1800 is quite recent, yet not recent enough to explain, potentially, a pilgrimage to a Hindu site from a Mediterranean populace. Even in the 21st century, Hinduism largely only exists in India, with such a small population of practicing Hindus in Greece, so little it doesn't even register a percent in the global population of people practicing Hinduism today. During the year 1800, we can guarantee this number would be much, much smaller. A research paper also highlights how it may be easy to assume that these people may have genetically been linked to Indo-Greek peoples after Alexander the Great's conquest. Yet, this is also unlikely, as the genetic makeup would be much, much more diverse than what it was shown. There's also the element of expeditions, which around the year of 1800 was becoming more common in the Himalayas. Yet there's absolutely no record in Greece nor elsewhere of an expedition in this area that may contain people of a very specific Cretan descent. So that's almost certainly off the table. Diet is another odd spot, but far less odd than the other findings. Their diets were terrestrial rather than marine, which indicates they likely lived inland rather than an island. Granted, Crete is a large island housing tons of land species, but these people could have lived inland. Just because Crete was the centerpiece in DNA replication doesn't necessarily pin them specifically on the island, but it certainly points at an incredibly close proximity, especially around the time of the 18th century. Another thing that research uncovered was the lack of any pathogenic DNA, which, in retrospect, often suggests things like an epidemic or even poisoning. You might think that there has to be a DNA or scientific mishap going on here, a potential scientific error. Me not being a biologist, I initially thought this to be more probable than a group of Cretan people perishing in a remote lake in the Himalayas. Turns out, these experiments are quite rigorous and are processed multiple times. There are multiple filters for DNA authenticity and more. I'll link to some of the scientific research papers I read through below. One critical thing I think wise to re-highlight is how truly strange of a location Roopkund Lake is. Aside from genealogical abnormalities, bizarre circumstances, the geology truly shows how weird this event is, even amidst a dangerous pilgrimage. To truly visualize this, let's take a closer look. Here is Roopkund Lake, tucked away and nestled on the edge of a cliff, below the peak of Tressul. Looking to the west, we see a valley that contains statues and temples in pocketed civilized areas containing sacred sites. But what's strange is just a valley over and to the northeast is the site of Nanda Devi Peak, a place that holds a ton of sacred religious importance. This peak has historically held tons of significance, and is certainly the site for a potential pilgrimage. Here's the problem. Roopkund Lake is far out of the way, as we can see here. The logical way to Nanda Devi is through a valley just to the north. If you wanted to go to Nanda Devi Peak, you wouldn't want to take the valley leading to Roopkund Lake and Trisul Peak, as the way to Nanda Devi from there is arguably impassable, at least for most foreign pilgrims. If possible, you would want to take the valley to the north. Now, Trisul Peak certainly held spiritual significance. Trisul is actually one of 3 peaks: Trisul 1, Trisul 2, and Trisul 3. For brevity, I hadn't referred to it as Trisul 1 until now. The 3 peaks representing what many believe to be an earthly interpretation of Shiva's trident. However, with this, Nanda Devi tended to hold more significance from a spiritual perspective. So, perhaps these people were lost. Certainly, from the group in 800 AD, that's absolutely plausible, if not likely. Or, potentially, did they mistake Trisul Peak for Nanda Devi Peak? This is also plausible. Now, for the Mediterranean group from 1800, if lost, why there? We've pretty much ruled out an expedition, at least formally, and we have no real understanding on why these people would be on a pilgrimage. Are we missing a chapter in anthropological history? Was there a relatively isolated, untouched community around the Himalayas, lasting all the way until the 18th century? This also seems far-fetched. For the first group, was Roopkund Lake an ancient burial ground? If so, it certainly deviates from traditional burial practices, and is, even for mountain-hardened natives, quite out of the way. On the surface, these don't seem like completely unreasonable explanations, especially in isolation. Yet we, nor does history, exist in isolation, and remains of around 800 people overall, some 1,000 years apart, is strange. Calling this strange is a massive understatement, and the whole thing is just plain odd. But that's all we have. Oddity. We truly have no idea why any of this occurred, and how to make sense of it. This doesn't have to be supernatural. It doesn't have to take a phantasmic form. I think, simply, the case of Roopkund Lake highlights the strange nature of history. That being, there's still a lot of unknowns in our world. Unknowns often overlooked. And if understanding is our goal, we need to be careful and discreet with these unknowns. We are a species who want to deeply understand things. We want to investigate. We want to uncover. It's clear that we have much more work to do regarding Roopkund Lake. I'm unsure if we will get definitive answers in our lifetime, but I do know more insight will be uncovered. We have a problem though. Roopkund Lake has become a much louder tourist destination. Hikers, backpackers have scoured the spot, placing bones from their original spots into small monoliths or statues. There's even been cases of people taking bones for themselves. This is tragic, as it not only disturbs the natural cohesion of a place sacred to many, but deeply jeopardizes our ability to get a better grip on what happened here. This has already deeply compromised the ability for researchers, biologists, anthropologists, and archaeologists to extract DNA and piece together the puzzle at large. Pollution is another problem as well. Nanda Devi National Park, as a World Heritage Site, has been shut down on numerous occasions due to this, with the Indian Army Corps of Engineers having to pick up remnants of visitors. Not only this, but in 1964, the CIA and India's Intelligence Bureau literally summited Nanda Devi Peak, and placed an irradiated plutonium-powered generator to spy on China, fearing they possess nuclear missiles. This mission failed miserably, and the entire generator fell off the mountain, contaminating water supplies and parts of local flora. Just 3 years later, the CIA challenged Mother Nature again, installed a signal device on another nearby mountain, only to find that China, in fact, did not have a nuclear weapon. I'm dead serious, this is not a joke, it's not a satirical James Bond movie pitch, this actually happened. Further, climate change is making this dilemma much more difficult as well. Glaciers are facing a warming crisis throughout the globe, with Nanda Devi Glacier in 2021 bursting, causing record floods and destroying 2 dams, further killing an estimated 200 or so people. In general, Roopkund Lake and other sacred remote sites are facing some severe challenges that jeopardize our ability to investigate further. I think the important thing to take away from this is that humans are incredibly complex and varied. Thus, history reflects this phenomenon. Like our planet, the special groups of people that inhabit it, the weird unknowns, are things that should not only be protected, but deeply respected. Thank you all for watching and making it to the end. This is my first video here, with many more to come. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing. With such a brand new channel, this means an absolute ton. Furthermore, I also have another channel called Epoch Philosophy, where I discuss anything around theory, philosophy, and even applied art. Thanks again for being here, and I hope you enjoyed. Hope to see you in the next one.